Hello and welcome to the Alpha Software Demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software. And today on our schedule, we will be talking about scheduling. But before we get started on scheduling, just a quick AV check. Just want to make sure that you can hear my voice and you can see my screen. It should say the word scheduling on the screen, a little picture of a computer. You could just type that into the questions box or the chat window. That would be great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. All right. So in the past, I don't know, 3 months ago or so, we had spoken quite a bit about APIs, building APIs in Alpha Anywhere to perform tasks. And those tasks were typically triggered by an event. Someone pushes a button or I don't know, a record is received, a webhook call is made, somehow the user interacts with an interface to make something happen. But today I want to talk about what happens when there is no human to push the button, and instead we're going to rely on a schedule, or what's known as a task scheduler. So some examples of why you might want to do this. Well, for example, let's say that at the end of the week you wanted to have a summary report of activity that took place. Maybe it's sales activity, maybe it's data collection activity. You didn't want to have be bugged each time a new piece of data comes in, but you'd like to see it in a summary report maybe once a week. So you could set up a schedule that once a week would generate an Alpha Anywhere report and send it off to you. Another example might be if you have an application that does data entry out in the field, something like Transform, for example, and you wanted to check to see maybe daily whether or not, or maybe every couple of days, whether or not people had in fact submitted data. So maybe they have data on their phone, but they haven't synchronized it yet to the system. You could write a script that goes through your database and says, oh wait, looks like Dave and Jim and Susan haven't uploaded data in the last couple of days. I'll send them off an SMS message reminding them that they need to synchronize their data. There's a million uses for doing data scheduling. And today we will be talking about how you actually do them. So you're probably wondering that because Alpha Anywhere, in fact, Alpha Transform doesn't actually have a scheduler built into it. So you do need to use another piece of technology. And today we're going to be taking a look at 4 different solutions. So the first solution, or the first couple of solutions, AWS's Event Bridge, that's Amazon Web Services, and Zapier are both cloud-based services that can be used for doing task scheduling. And there's another couple that I'm going to talk about. There's Task Scheduler and KRON. These are pieces, these are software that you can run on a computer that you have direct control over. In the case of Task Scheduler, that runs on Windows. In the case of KRON, that runs on everything except Windows. So those are a couple options. I'm going to talk about how you set these up and what the relative advantages are to each of them. Of course, I'm also here to answer questions, so go ahead, if you like, and type those questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. And let's get cracking. All right, so let's take a look first at Amazon Web Services. Several months ago, I showed you how to set up what we called a reverse proxy. So we had a machine on Amazon Web Services that just looked for incoming requests. That went through a web server called Nginx, and that passed the requests over through a reverse proxy to a server that was located behind a firewall, so it could safely serve up your application without the application actually being on AWS. It's still running on your own system. So a lot of people are using AWS for that reason, or they're using AWS for RDS, for relational database services, and for some other reasons as well. And so if you already have an AWS account, that might be a good reason to take a look at Amazon Event Bridge. It is a paid service, but you get an awful lot of calls free of charge. So in many cases, I imagine that Event Bridge would be actually either totally free or practically totally free for your use. Let's take a look and see how Amazon Event Bridge is set up. So we're going to pop over here to the AWS console. And over here, once I've selected Amazon Event Bridge, there's going to be some options here on the left. One of the options, it's actually not showing here, but is a option to create an API destination. I think API destination is probably 1 or 2 down here below my mouse. So that's actually the first thing that you do in Amazon Web Services is you connect this thing called create an API destination. So I created one, I called it Goof Canoe, and I pointed it to my API endpoint, which is here at goofcanoe.com. And then you have some options. You could say, would you like to post data to it? Would you like to use get? Would you like to use put? And then you can also supply data in the header a little bit further down. And it has options for authentication. You can use usernames and passwords. You can use OAuth. You can use a couple other things to make sure that the system has permission to connect to your API. So that said, there might be a case in which you might not necessarily even need to worry about authorization connecting to the API, because the API might also be smart enough to say, oh, look, I've just been woken up by this service, and it itself could check to see, oh, is it time for me to do something? So you don't necessarily have to go crazy protecting that if you've added some protection into your application itself. Hope that made sense. Anyway, after you create the API destination, the next thing you do in AWS is you go and you create a new rule. So you'd think schedule, but actually rule is the thing you set up. It's called an Event Bridge rule. And when you create that rule, you give it a name, and then you tell it that you would like to run on a schedule as opposed to running some other way, being triggered some other way. When you select schedule, you have actually a lot of control. You could do fine-grained control, or you could just do something that runs every 10 minutes or something like that, or runs every hour like I have in this example here. But in the example that I had used before, where you want the report at the end of the week, maybe you have it run at, 5 p.m. on a Friday or something like that. And you can do that using AWS. So once that's set up, you will see, basically, once you've set up how often you wanted to do it, you're going to tell it that the target, in other words, what happens when the schedule happens, is going to happen with an event API destination. So the API destination is the one that we created before. It was called Goof Canoe. So we've just basically set up the destination to use that. Once that is done, you can go back and see that your rule has been enabled, and it shows you, how often it's going to. You can take a look and see how often it's been triggered. Hasn't been triggered yet here, and then off you go. There's also some stuff that you can do in AWS. I believe it's called a dead letter file, where it can actually sort of check to see whether or not it was successful. So that's something else we should probably talk about is that just because you've set up a scheduler, it is a good idea to have something check on that scheduler to make sure that the scheduler itself hasn't broken. Imagine like a scheduler to check on the scheduler, if you will, but we'll talk about that later. Once that's done, you're all set. And so when that event occurs, it's going to call that API and it's going to perform that action. And that's all you need to do that in Amazon Event Bridge. Now, the other cloud service I wanted to talk about was Zapier. We've incorporated Zapier with Alpha Transform. So that's actually connected right out of the box. If you wanted to make a scheduled call to Transform, you would just simply log into your Zapier account and set up the schedule as the trigger and Alpha Transform as the event. But in the case of Alpha Anywhere, you're going to instead be calling an API that's not integrated here in Zapier. So you're going to want to use a webhook. So when you set up something in Zapier, again, Zapier is a workflow type product. A Zapier Zap includes two things. One's called the trigger, and that's what sets off the thing that Zapier is going to do. And in this case, it's a schedule. So we've set it to schedule as our means of a trigger. And then there's an action. So there's at least one trigger and one action in every Zapier Zap. And the action is to get a webhook in Zapier. And so when you set that up, you set it up pretty similarly to how we did it before. We put in the URL of our API. And one nice thing about Zapier is you can actually test it out right in Zapier. You can say, okay, go ahead and run that script now, and I just want to see what happens. And what you'll see happens is you'll get back actually the data or whatever the API gives back. In this case, I didn't really point it to a real API. I just pointed it to a web page. So what I got back was the web page data. But this pretty much works as I would have expected it to do. So that's all you need to do for Zapier. Now, Zapier requires a paid account in order to use this service because the webhook feature is a premium feature. You could check out pricing. It's not too bad, but it's not as cheap as Amazon Web Services. All right. The next thing I want to talk about, we're moving pretty quickly here today, that's pretty good, is the task scheduler. So with task scheduler, this is built into Windows, and this is, even though we're looking at Windows 10 right here, it is in Windows 11. I suspect it'll be in future versions as well. It's used a lot, especially by people in IT and in administration. With the task scheduler, you can find that right in your start menu. Just type in task scheduler or schedule. And if you launch that, what you'll end up with is a dialog box will appear, or the task schedule app, I'm sorry, will appear. Over here on the left are the tasks that have been set up to run. And you'll see that some are already set up for your system. A lot of programs actually use Task Scheduler to do things like make sure that the latest version has been installed from time to time, as well as some other things as well. But you can create a new task by clicking on the icon Create New Task over here in the Actions pane. When you do that now. Come on. Next slide. Here we go. When we do that, you'll give the task a name, and then you'll tell it how often you want it to run. Now, in this, when you're first setting it up, you'll see that the choices are daily, weekly, monthly, and so on. It didn't have the fine-grained control that you saw, for example, in Event Bridge just a moment ago, the Amazon Web Services solution. However, it is possible to get more granular than this, and I'll show you how you do it. But let's say you wanted to run something every hour. The first thing you would do is just choose one of these, daily, weekly, or monthly. I chose daily. Then when you set up your action, then the next thing you do is set up your action. And so we'll go do that now. And the actions are in Task Scheduler. There are 3 of them. 2 of them don't work anymore. One, you used to be able to send an email and send a message when something happened, but it can still start a program. So the question is, what program do we want it to start? We really want it to do is call an API. Well, there is a program in Windows built in that can call APIs, and it is called KRON. I'm not actually sure, I take that back, whether or not KRON comes with Windows out of the box or if it comes with Alpha Anywhere out of the box, but if you install Alpha Anywhere, you will definitely have KRON on your system. What KRON lets you do is it lets you specify a URL, and if you want some parameters that go with that URL, and it will make a call basically to the server. And in this case, it would kick off your API. So to do that, you'll find that curl is going to be in your system 32 folder. You can browse to get there. And then under arguments, all you have to do is just pass it the URL and the query string that you would like to use in there. So that's all there is to it. And when that's done, you come to this screen. And on this screen, it says the only thing that I needed to change here on this property screen is to check the box saying run whether the user is logged in or not. That's kind of important. I'll tell you why. You may have automatic updates applied, say, to your Windows machine. And if that's the case, somewhere around 2, 3 a.m. maybe, those updates will be applied. Your system will reset, but it doesn't log you back into the system. Well, you want this to continue to run even when you're not logged into the system. So in the case of a Windows update, or maybe you're recovering from a power failure or something like that, you want to make sure that this is going to continue to run. So just make sure you've checked that box. Once that's done, you will see the event placed up here at the top, and it is ready to be called, and it will be called in this case every day. So now let's say we wanted more fine granular control. What I could do is I could select here this Goof Canoe thing or my web service and select edit. And when I select edit, I edit the trigger, you'll see that I actually have some advanced settings, and I can say repeat the task every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, or so on. I can have it work on a random delay. Not sure why I'd want to do that, but you can, and you can control other things over here as well. So once that's set up, you are good to go. It will go kick off your API as often as you have programmed it to do it. So the question is, the last one with Zapier, for example, you're able to test out that event to make sure that it actually worked. How do you test that out here to make sure it works? I'll show you. The way that I would do that is once I've set up my event in Task Scheduler, I would go ahead and click this run button over here to make it run right away. And then once it run away, I should be able to go and look in the Alpha Anywhere server logs and find that something executed at the time that I ran my script. So to do that, I just go into server settings. In this case, I'm in the developer server settings, but it's the same for the IIS and the standard application server as well. Make sure, of course, that you have logging turned on. If this is not turned on, you'll need to turn it on before you go ahead and run that script. And once the access log is on, you just click open. It opens it up in Notepad. You just scroll down to the end and see when the last request came in, and you can see that what it was asking for. So you could see that it was asking for your API at a certain time, and you can be reasonably confident that Windows Task Scheduler will be able to call that API on time. So that's a pretty cool system, and one that I am actually planning to use in an upcoming project. Now, the last one I'm going to talk about, and I'm not going to go into huge detail here, is KRON. KRON is an old program, almost 50 years old, and it runs on Unix-like operating systems. So that's Unix and Linux. It runs on Mac OS, but it doesn't run on Windows. People have made ported versions for Windows. They don't seem that common. And frankly, I'm not sure I would use KRON on a Windows machine, given that Task Scheduler is already there and has a much nicer interface to work with. But with KRON, basically what you do, and this KRON comes built in with these operating systems. KRON is a two-part system. One is the KRON daemon. That's the program that keeps checking what time it is and seeing if it needs to perform a task. And the second is the file that contains the tasks that need to be performed and how often they need to be performed. That's called the KRON tab file. So to use that, what you would do is you would just go into Linux, and if you want to go command line like I sometimes do, and just use the nano editor to open up that KRON tab file. And it gives you some examples. There are a lot more examples on the web. There are even builders on the web for building out these lines. But the gist of it is this. These first 5 parameters let you know sort of, I think it's, hour, week, day of the month. I forget which order they go in, but in this case, I think this says every Friday or something like that. I want you to, these 5 parameters, I want you to, in this case, run a tar program that does a backup. You wouldn't use tar, though, with your cron tab thing to call an API. You'd probably use something like wget. So you'd put in the first 5 parameters for cron, telling you how often you want to call that API. And then you would put in wget, and you would put in the parameters that were necessary to run your API. Now, this seems kind of convoluted and complicated, but it's actually pretty easy once you have it set up. And if you already have an EC2 machine, let's say over at Amazon, that you're using as a reverse proxy, you could always use cron over there, for example. You could also use it using a single board computer like a Raspberry Pi and a bunch of other things as well. So cron pretty much works with everything. So that is pretty much it for today. I just wanted to make sure that you guys have got a handle on scheduling, and at least 4 different ways to do it. If you've got questions, go ahead and type them into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. Of course, you can always send them to guides, GUIDES @alphasoftware.com as well. Someone says so I'm looking at a couple of comments here, you want to make sure that you're using an account that has a password that doesn't change. Yes, that's actually a good point as well. And that's true both on Task Scheduler as well as your API. How do you debug a page that works on desktop and Android, but not on a mobile Apple device? I know that works desktop and Android. Okay, can you send a little bit more information in on that question so that I fully understand what you're asking, but I'd be happy to answer it. Okay, the next one is a question, and I don't think I would know how to answer this today, but it's a really good question. Can you talk about generating a PDF through Alpha that's integrated with an e-signature platform like DocuSign, PandaDoc, etc. That is really interesting. I will go and figure out, I know we've done this for clients, I just don't know how to do it off the top of my head. I will take a look at that. That's a really interesting demonstration. So I'll make a note of that. Thank you. And that looks like it. Wonderful. Hey, wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for showing up today. Appreciate it. If you do have questions, send them into guides, guides@alphasoftware.com. And we hope to see you next week at the next Alpha Software demo and Q&A webcast. Until then, take care and stay well. Bye-bye.